think we definitely have to talk about the bike. This is like a low-key sick research tip, is have something cool in your background. So, Bretton, what's up with your bike? What kind of a bike is it? What do people want to know about your bike in these interviews?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't even know. They just like the color, and it makes me feel like part of me feels shameful because I'm like, realistically, when was the last time I took my bike out? It's winter in Toronto. It's winter in Toronto, but it's both this like deeply shameful thing where I'm like, oh, I took my bike out last in August. It is now
Ooh.
December. But it's a pandemic bike. So when I used to live in San Francisco, I commuted to my job from San Francisco. It was in Palo Alto, and I used to bike with all of the bikers.
That's a long bike ride.
But I did it on a steel framed bike. I was much younger then. I was in my early 20s, and I felt like a lot of pride in the fact that I had a steel frame bike. But then during the pandemic, I was much older. I was cycling a lot with people, and I was very slow because they all had carbon bikes. They were like, little bullets. And then I got one and my life changed, and I feel like I can't go back. So
that's so funny. That's so funny. That's such a long bike ride too, to be doing on a heavy bike. What is that, like an hour?
Yeah, it was amazing though, because everyone's asleep, and they used to go like in huge cohorts. So it's like, San Francisco's asleep. We started in the Mission, and we would bike down. It was great.
Is there a bike path, or are you're on the highway?
No. There's a bike that you can like finish. There's a nice like set of trails that you can go on. So you stay off the highway.
All right, that seems safe. Cool. So this is funny because I feel like this is the most times I've rescheduled a meeting or a podcast where it actually happens. So I'm glad that we finally made this happen. Here we are. There's a bunch of cool stuff about the work that you do that I want to dig into.
Sure.
But before we do that, like LaunchDarkly is a really sick company that I think people have really clued into it, especially I feel like in the product community, everyone kind of, they get it. Like, and so people really like it. So, why don't you unpack a little bit what LaunchDarkly is, and when did you start as well?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with how I got interested in LaunchDarkly from a research perspective, which is interesting. And maybe we'll start at Wealthsimple. So I was at Wealthsimple for over 2 years in Toronto, kind of the staff researcher working across all of our product surface areas. After a while, I moved to the data science team. To be partnered when like triangulation was very big. I worked with a chief economist there, and we did a lot of propensity models and experimentation where we would pair like our modeling. We had quite sophisticated segmentation practices as well. And we used LaunchDarkly at that point to experiment. So LaunchDarkly was a way for us to partition our audiences to serve different variations of what we were working on. And it's interesting because at Wealthsimple, very consumer tech focused, I had no idea about the deepness of developer tools and developer software. And for me, I was like, oh, it's interesting because LaunchDarkly is a really cool way that you can serve variations to like our different segments of users. And I thought that was like a very sweet thing because it allowed us to experiment at scale and experiment not just A/B testing, but like multiple variations of a thing. But we did all of our kind of statistical analysis in-house because we had a data science team that we are very interested in doing it. Little did I know that was only one tiny piece of what is LaunchDarkly. And so when I went to LaunchDarkly, I realized like LaunchDarkly is our whole goal is to make software releases less risky. And part of that, which I didn't realize too, is that John Kodamal, who was the founder, separated the deployment from the release process. So before, like when you deployed code, you often deployed it to production. It was a very wonky process. So you'd push the code you'd push the code, and then it would be live for like your audience or variations of audiences. If something went wrong from a developer standpoint, it still happens for many, many people, many developers now. It would take quite a bit of effort to roll things back. So like you push terrible code to production and then something goes terribly wrong. Then it takes a while to pull it back. And at the foundation, LaunchDarkly pulled those two things apart. so you could test in production at scale. So you could roll things,
you
could deploy code to production and then release when you're ready. And not only release when you're ready, but release to whoever you wanted at whatever time. And that was just the beginning of the promise. And now what's cool in the world of AI and the world of like much more sophisticated database tooling, we're starting to roll in like observability metrics, so you can start to have that recursive feedback loop, kind of that dream.
Yeah.
So not only do you release things out, you don't have to go to your other terminal to like look in your observability tooling or even your product analytics tooling to say like what's actually happening. It's like that context can be with you. So you can say like, oh, is something happening that's bad? And we automatically allow you to roll that back. In addition,
it seems like a great research tool too, right?
Yeah, it is a great research tool. And it's so, I find like I didn't know before how cool developer tooling, like developer workflows, developer tooling is, because I'm a big systems person. So it's like, LaunchDarkly is deployed, like is out there in the world in the context of like a whole array of tools and a whole array of organizations. So we work with companies that have 10,000 developers and they have LaunchDarkly in addition to all of their other tooling, their GitHubs and then their like analytics platforms. And not only that, but in an organizational context, you often have LaunchDarkly, like a feature flagging tool, deployed alongside of like internal, like homegrown tools and other competitors, all within the context of the same organization. So it's like endlessly complex.
That's crazy. I love what you're saying about thinking in systems. I feel like this is like a chronic problem in the research space, is we don't think in systems. And I feel like this is about to change in a major way. So now I need to get your feedback on my thesis for one of the next big research platforms that I don't think exists yet. Maybe someone will make it into part of their platform. But just like, and this ties in with the developer tools, because I've always been really impressed with like a lot of the stuff, which makes sense. I mean, they're engineers, right? So when they have a problem with something to do with engineering, they just build it themselves.
Absolutely.
So I have a feeling that because with all this new AI stuff, that usability testing will start to look a lot more like unit testing. And whenever you have a release go out, you'll have a massive essentially deployment of a usability test that goes out across different customer user segments that it's very, very low level, simple research, very easy to synthesize, very easy to analyze, just looking for problems with the release, right? And you can do it with like 1,000 people at once. And so then you'll end up having like just like a new essentially release system that is focused on the usability and the UX aspect of what used to only be doable as like a developer tool. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense to me. And I believe on top of that too, that the tooling around intercepts. So not only could you identify those problems, but you'd be able to potentially intercept those customers. I think some of the coolest intercept tools that I've seen are AI driven, in the sense of like you can have like a discussion with someone that's having a problem in the context of the problem they're having and capture that for synthesis. So I totally see it. I see a lot of value. I mean, at the same time, that is the future edge, but there's still so many laggards. So like part of it is like, how do we balance that? Like there's such cool tooling, but then a lot of people can't even deploy usability testing at scale now, like even with the current tooling we have.
Yeah. Whatever this tool, product, platform happens to be, they're going to eat user testing's lunch, because I feel like that's what a lot of people use it for, and it's hella expensive. One thing I really wanted to talk to you about is you work closely with the leadership team, I believe, if I understand correctly, at LaunchDarkly. I think particularly the CTO. Is that right?
CPO. So
CPO. Okay.
CTO, formerly CTO, and even like I've been through 2 transitions of leadership. So I think that's something also that's interesting we could talk about, but go ahead.
Yeah, we should definitely talk about that. New topic to add in there, because obviously so much of our success is relationship driven.
Absolutely.
And so you're talking about building new relationships, but so you had this experience, you've worked with a bunch of people like in more of let's just say a traditional research structure at like Wealthsimple, for example. Talk to me about what the working relationship has been like with yourself, working, essentially reporting into like CTO, CPO, whatever it happened to be. What are the types of things they wanted to know about? How was that different? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I worked with even at Wealthsimple, I worked with the CPO then. So I feel like those are the people, and maybe I'll kind of like put it through my own reflection and transformation as a researcher too. And I think part of what the CPOs or CTOs are looking for is different because they have so much intuition in their leadership. And I think part of it was just becoming much more humble as a researcher, and much more interested and engaged with really understanding where they're coming from and where their data points are. And maybe it's like part of me as like a junior researcher, there was kind of like a skepticism to be like, if there's no data to inform this, then like these are just hypotheses and they could be wildly wrong. And part of it was like, in the places that I've worked that are the best, I have trust in my leaders, because right now so much of what it means to be innovative or to push against the future is to take big bets or take big risks, which are driven by intuition. So I think for working with the CTO or the CPO is really just understanding how much knowledge and expertise they bring to the table. And part of it actually has been me like coming into my own authority, because there's so much imposter syndrome going into it, to be like, how do I even, like, you are the leader of this massive, like, hundreds of $1 million or even $1 billion company. Like, it's taken you so much to get there. And that really, part of what they're most interested in is those surprises and being able to challenge their assumptions, but not in a way that feels destructive. So it's like part of it is just me, I'll do some very specific examples. John Kodemal, the former CTO of LaunchDarkly, incredible engineer and developer. He has a PhD in computer science, like built from the ground up, basically LaunchDarkly. And I'm not a developer. I don't have an engineering background. And so a lot of it was just trying to really understand how he understood the market to be, where he understood those gaps to be. And then for me, working to figure out how to push those to figure out who to put in the room or what data to bring in the room to really push him in a way. So it's like downloading that information and then equipping myself to say like, okay, I don't have all of the knowledge or information that I need. He's clearly the expert in this field, but he has his own anxieties about what that future might look like. His ideas are also wild in some ways. And so it's like, how do I hold that and then be able to pressure test that against the kind of evidence that's useful to them? And that's different for every person, right? For the CTO at that point, it was really figuring out that expert developer opinion to help him say, like, he wanted to evaluate this, and he was like, make sure that we were anxious about these certain ideas. And I think some of the ideas that we came to bear, I can't talk about all of them yet, but some of the ideas that we were pressure testing, we ended up saying no to. And that like, I think means that there was a high degree of trust there, that he trusted that I could hold this idea. And there's so much anxiety about that. And we were able to bring in enough information to say, like, you know what, this isn't the right opportunity, even if this crux of this idea is here. And that crux of the idea just helped him to go much further, so that we ended up slightly pivoting into what will be a future product offering, if that helps. It's a little bit generic, but.
I have a follow-up question on that. By the way, do you have clicking sounds on your end? Are you potentially tapping a keyboard? No? Okay.
No.
Okay, cool. All right. We'll see if it goes away. My follow-up question is, would you say, so generally speaking, these types of people, they have a ton of knowledge. They have a ton in their heads. There is, obviously you have to be very strong-headed to take things to that far, right? At the same time, you have to be open to what the world tells you about what the world wants, and you're not always exactly right. How do you, is it different for the different execs that you've worked with where they reconcile conflicting information in different ways? They ask for conflicting information, or they ask for you to go out and get information that might subvert their opinions in different ways? Or was it more or less consistent across all three?
They're all very different, but I mean, like, maybe I'll just say that I've been very lucky to have such great leaders. And maybe as a researcher, when you're working in those spaces, I imagine that that's like for me, when I went to LaunchDarkly, that's what I was looking for. And that's what I found in John. And even Claire Vaux, the new CPO, she's an incredibly intelligent, incredibly humble leader. She's so driven. She has such a clear vision, but she's so easy to talk to. So I feel like I've been lucky in that sense because they have such expertise and it can be so intimidating. But at the same time, like, I've been able to bring up my concerns or bring up areas of interest that I've been able to come to the table and show up as a researcher and do the things that we're meant to do the best, to ask the hard questions, to talk about the areas of concern, without any fear of reprimand, I guess. And I think that's really a testament to the leaders that I've worked with more than like general. I don't know that that's the case for everyone, but I've found that I haven't had that kind of struggle. And maybe it's just because I'm not intimidated by that space. And I've had, even Claire be like, well, I think that's really dumb. And that, like, an idea that I had. And then you're like, well, but like, I appreciate that. Like, that's not scary to me. And I was like, then it's like, tell me more about why you think this idea is dumb. And I was like, okay, totally. I get that. Like, I can respect that. And then you just move on. And maybe that's a space where I can just inhabit that, to be like, part of maybe even for researchers too, is like, I think my biggest struggle hasn't been getting to the table. It's like inhabiting my own authority. Because a lot of times it's like you get nervous or like feel intimidated, or like a lot of the ways that I've been able to work in organizations is through like really understanding what my stakeholders need and present them what they like, and to give them the information they need, which has meant like contorting myself in particular ways to get the information I need across. And part of, as I've matured as a leader, and I've even been dinged for this, like in my performance reviews, is that I don't properly inhabit my authority. It's like I hide my PhD. It's like, that's like a liability that I hide away. Like I hide away like my strong opinions. And I think part of it more is learning to inhabit that more than like, how do I get to the table, if that makes sense.
We're going to unpack a thing here. So I can't really speak to this situation, but I recently was able to observe some work involving a bunch of researchers and whatnot. And one thing that really struck me was it's not very on the surface at all, but just reading people's behaviors struck me that there was a tremendous amount of insecurity underlying the craft, the people, the this, the that, and it shows up in interesting ways, which I never really noticed before. And it was because I was able to draw a very stark contrast in this situation, but like talking a lot in meetings when you don't have anything to say, right? Just so that people hear your voice. You'd be like, I'm here too, right? Asking questions where it's obvious, or in a setting with lots of other people. So you're like, look, I'm present. I'm being inquisitive, right? Or trying to have a 5-minute conversation of something that's probably one DM message or one back and forth. And what you're saying, like what you just mentioned with Claire, where she's like, hey, I think this is a dumb idea, right? I can just put myself, especially from a few years ago, in your shoes and picture that. And that those are like soul crushing words, right? Like, honestly, now today I've for a number of reasons, I have more confidence in that. I really think I know what I'm talking about with some of these things, like or whatever.
Totally.
Where now if someone said that to me, my response is, okay, well, let's unpack this situation right here. Like, okay, I'm obviously not saying that it's something that I think is dumb. I don't think I'm a dumb person. So like clearly we have a misalignment here of like an understanding of the universe. We should talk about it and figure out if we can figure out who's right. But that wouldn't affect me anymore. But that would have destroyed me like 5 years ago.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Does that ring true for you, that sense of like security where today you're like, no, I am an amazing, like a dope researcher. So like, I really know my stuff. So if you don't think that something's not smart, let's have a conversation. It's not you attacking me.
But I do think for researchers, that's the area, though, where we could do a little bit more too. And that's maybe where I'm talking about, like, it is a struggle that I have, but I actually feel like that's the growth area that I'm in right now, is working through that. And I mean, like, realistically, it makes sense for researchers. Like, I've been this is my third or fourth, like, unicorn style startup. And in all of them, the research team minus me has like been wiped out in one way or the other. And so like, there's like,
I remember some of those wipeouts actually.
It's like a general anxiety that research has as like a form and function to say like, are we, and then there's all of these preconceived notions about who thinks what about research. And so for you, especially, or like for me, as I'm sitting in these positions, I feel one, like, oh, it's only a matter of time before it's going to be me. Or like, I'm constantly having to prove my worth, which makes us skirt around the fact that like, actually, as long as you're thinking in the logics of the business, like, because I think for a lot of researchers, we don't, but like, I think the reason that I've been able to stay is that like, I really understand the logics of my businesses. And then if you can talk in those languages, you're okay. But I also think it's made us more anxious about stepping forward and having that authority. And I do think that that's the value as a researcher when you can do that, and not to say like, your entire company is wrong, let's do this thing, but to be able to say like, look, I know we're invested in this piece of work, but being able to stand with the research that you've done because you trust it enough, and say like, I've been in a lot of situations actually where research that I presented was not what the business wanted to hear, which is often the case, that like fragile balance. It's not what they wanted to hear because it means that we have to backtrack, or it means we're like off on alignment, or like, that this isn't going to work. And I think I've had it happen enough where the research, even if initially rejected, like I've been in initial share out meetings for someone where like the head of product was like, I don't believe this at all. I think it's like, this is a waste of my time, only to come back a year later to the exact same findings of that research. And so I think that kind of like learned intuition is just like, and it's not worth fighting in that time. And maybe that's where for researchers too, like sometimes the timing is just as important as the findings. And so like, there's been a lot of times where like, if the organizational appetite is such that they're not interested in hearing something at that moment, it doesn't mean that it's not valuable. It doesn't mean that it's not true. It means maybe it's not the right time, and trying to force it down people's throat is actually going to do more harm than good, because you have to prime the appetite. So you're like, okay, well, let's just let this launch. We come back 6 months later, adoption is tanked, and we're like, oh, let's talk about this. And then you just like shuffle the research and pull it back up, brush it off, and then maybe like represent it, and then everything instead of, but I think that there has to be a humbleness too, because there's a way you could be like, well, told ya. And but another part is just like, look, like we're all trying to do the best job that we can do. The product manager is just as invested in the business as you. Their markers of success are so different. So like, we are a team, and sometimes you don't want to hear the hard things when you need to, but there will be a time when we can share that together. And as long as I've felt like we're doing it together, I've had much more success, I guess.
A lot of that rings true for me. I have what you're talking about with this research being ignored stuff. I have it rings true for an experience of mine, but it did not have a happy ending, and it never. And I also, frankly, fucked the relationship up too, right?
Yeah.
Like all these mistakes that you're talking about, like, hey, don't fight them, don't this. Yeah, no,
it's hard to. But I think that's where it's really hard to do that. But I like, maybe where I still love my job and I still love being a researcher is because I don't take it personally. And it's also like, I can't, having a vendetta against an organization is actually just a recipe for failure for both me and the research function. And so it's like I had like
this is like way more mature than I'm ready for. And I really wish we had this conversation 8 years ago. Like this is really what I really needed to hear when I was 20, whatever, because you're just saying like, don't have a vendetta against the organization. I'm literally like, ugh. I still think about them like, ugh, no, that hurts because it's true, right? I feel like, I exactly what you said. I took it all personally, right? I took it all personally. Why don't you listen to me? You think I'm lying to you? You think I'm making this up? You think it's nice to share these results? Like, no, right? But having that more of an indifference thing, I think I think that's really powerful and it comes from, again, I feel like you have this sense of security in your capabilities and you really know what you're doing. And I think this is missing from a lot of folks, even who have the skills and capabilities and understanding and all that, where it's just like, okay, if you want to ignore it, you can ignore it. I know what this is, and I know it's not wrong. And we can come back to it when it's more painful in 6 months or 9 months or a year or whatever it happens to be. That's fine with me.
I don't say this because I'm like came out fully evolved. I think I've been through a lot of trials and tribulations. And I mentioned before that, like, I had a great design leader in a previous job who really laid that out for me. Like, then like you not inhabiting your authority is actually a detriment to your role. And I really like, that was like a very helpful thing to hear, because that helped and I think it's just over time. And even for me, as I'm like mentoring younger researchers, I'm also just like, like this stuff happens. It's how decision making isn't like it's not linear. Decision making is like a complex operation, especially in organizations, especially in this environment where the decisions feel so high stakes and like realistically, unless like you're not going to be able to have perfect information to make decisions. So you have to gather what you can and then like make a call, and then trust that if you will make the wrong call, that you'll be able to make a different call. And I think maybe even part of that is that like, I don't think it's helpful in organizations to be in like constant battle with your stakeholders, because it doesn't help. And I think for me, just really trying to understand, like, look, we think about the world very differently, but at the end of the day, we both believe that the decisions we're making will lead to the same thing, which is like, this product is going to land, or we're solving the right use case. And so it's like, clearly something is informing them differently than it's informing me. And so I need to figure out what that map looks like. I think in our leadership team, we had this saying once, which was share the same map. It was like a value.
Yeah.
And so it was like, to me, that really resonates, that like, when I'm like, oh, we are not sharing the same map, then I'm like, how can we try to share the same map in a bit different way? And that makes it less like at odds with each other, and be like, our maps, we're looking at totally different maps. Their map is upside down, mine is sideways. And so then, of course, we think one person thinks it's left, one person thinks it's right or up. And that, like, the exercise for me then is to be like, how do we share the same map so that we can, and that helps the alignment piece.
One thing that it also makes me think of, and I don't know, producer Maggie, if you can look this up, but there's a saying, I can't remember who said it. I feel like it was a famous actor, but it was essentially, it's like, be so good you're undeniable, essentially, right? And I think there's really an element to that of, like when you step into the room now in your role at LaunchDarkly and you're talking to these people, and that you're great at research, and not just like not research the activity. I'm talking about research the role that creates really powerful value for the organizations that it's a part of. You're really good at that. So there is no any slight, it's not even an insult, but just criticism, critique that can just roll off your back, because like you reach a certain point and you're just undeniably great. And why are you undeniably great at this? It's because you understand every part of the foundational elements of the role, understanding how a business works, like actually understanding relationships, understanding the activities of research, understanding critical thinking, evaluation of evidence, all that stuff, understanding how to bring creativity into the work that you do to drive home results in situations where things are difficult or resources are constrained. Thank you, Maggie. The quote is, "Be so good they can't ignore you," from Steve Martin. There you go.
Yeah.
Right.
Like
and
that.
Like, there are, and obviously in research it's harder because it's, you can't really measure in like some sort of quantifiable way the effectiveness of somebody. But look, when there's a layoff, nobody fires successful salespeople, right? They're just like, if you're undeniably great at sales and you hit your quotas and surpass your quotas every quarter, you will never, ever be laid off. That makes no sense. Okay. And she's following up saying, I confused two quotes. One of them is "Be So Good They Can't Ignore You" by Steve Martin. The other one is "Be Undeniable" by Kobe Bryant. So
I like
I don't know
it.
what that says about me, but there's the two of them.
Kobe Bryant Martin.
Kobe Bryant Martin. I like it. Mr. Guy.
I mean, what I will say though is that, like, as I'm thinking, like, what would I want to hear as a researcher? I'm like, this is the talk, but it doesn't mean that I'm so fully formed or confident or like have such organizational authority that I'm like flawless. Honestly, this week I was talking to an engineering manager and she was like, "What do you do?" And she's been there forever. So it's like, she's like, what does research do? And I just say that so that people aren't like, oh, there's something so different about this Bretton character that like, clearly it's a personality, like clearly this person is like unflappable. Like literally people are still like, what do you do? And before, especially as a younger person, I would be like, oh, I'd be like, oh no, I've failed. And now I'm just like, well, do you have some time? Let's chat. And I'm like, part of it is that like, I no longer get lofty and I'm like, unmet needs of customers. I explained some things and I was like, actually, to put this a different way, what problem would you like help solving? And that's often how I approach this. And then, she explained to me something that she was working with. And I was like, oh, actually, I can help you with that. And so then it's like less about being like, research is, and more like, if I do my job well, it means that I solve problems for people in my organization, usually decision-making problems. But that doesn't mean that I still don't encounter people who are like, what do you do? Or like, aren't you a designer? Or things like that.
So I had that conversation. So I had somebody ask me that once, but it wasn't like one-on-one. It was in front of the entire, this person was a senior product manager, in front of the entire product team at an all hands, like a product all hands meeting. They're like, why do we need a researcher? I'm like right there. I'm like, yo, do you want to take this offline? Like, I'm happy to explain it in front of all these people, but I know you didn't mean it that way.
Yeah.
But you're basically asking why this job role exists in this organization.
I mean, I think I used to like shy away from that question, but now I'm like, actually, that's what makes research jobs so great. And that's why I like them so much, because there's not a clear articulate, like so much of decision making in organizations is so messy. And the most interesting problems are so complex that there's not, if only there were a simple solution. And I think for a lot of people, even in business, you're like, oh yeah, you just choose A or B, or you just do this thing. But actually, there's so much nuance there and so much messiness. And I think I was just reading some article, where it's like, for a researcher's role, it's like you see the tip of the iceberg is like what you think the role is, but actually it's like the entire, like the bottom of the iceberg that's submerged like below the water. And I actually, like, for a while, I was worried about that messiness, but now I'm like, I think that's why I keep coming back. That's why my job is still interesting. That's why I can wake up every day and be like, who knows what I'm going to do this quarter, this day, this week, this day. And I have to recognize that part of my personality, and I think a lot of the personalities of researchers that I know, it keeps them interested. Like, I would be so bored if I had to do the same thing. And that like part of that complexity is going to be really hard to clearly articulate. Even in my family, there's a joke amongst my sisters-in-law, et cetera, that like they think I'm an astronomer or something. Like they don't actually know what I do. I think because I've done a lot of work in like scenario planning and like future thinking, like somehow they like thought I was an astronomer. I'm not. This is not even a joke. Like that is a literal thing that they thought. And then I don't know. Now I'm just like, well, that's great. Great.
Sure.
Cool.
Why not? I feel like, you know, to your point, like the let's just say messianic terms in which we describe ourselves sometimes probably are very irritating to hear from a stakeholder where I represent the user. I am the champion of the voice of the customer. It's like, you are a little full of yourself. Like that is, like, I don't feel like I want to collaborate with you, right? It's just, we could tone it down a little bit, right?
Yeah, because it sets us up for failure too. If you're like, I am the voice of the customer.
The champion of the user doesn't know everything that the users wants. I thought you were the champion of the user.
Yeah, and you're like, oh, especially in a
Not
B2B
looking so
org.
good, champ.
Exactly. And you're like, oh, like, and that's why I think even enablement is so powerful, or like helping with decision making in that way. Especially, I am still a researcher of one at LaunchDarkly. Just that's how we've kept it in our team.
Which is wild, right? Like, if you think like LaunchDarkly is not a small company, you know, and
yeah. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you're a researcher and you're thinking about your career and what work looks like, whatever we saw happen 2020 to 2022 of these like gargantuan research teams that are just churning out studies and usability tests, like that is a way to work. It's probably not a very capital efficient way for organizations to be run, and they're going to lean away from that type of stuff. So like adapting your career, like ask yourself, if you can ask yourself the question, if I was the only researcher in a company of 500 people, what would I be working on? Who would I be working with? How would I work with those people, right? How do I prepare myself to be in a situation like that? You know, what books do I need to read? You know, what perspective do I need to gain? Do I need to know a little bit about marketing, a little bit about engineering, a little bit about customer success? Do I need to understand how like company planning works? Like those are all really good things to know. And if you get out of the mindset of, I'm here to like take orders from X and Y product manager, and more, what if I was the only person here? What would I be working on?
Yeah.
You might end up with like prioritizing your learning and development a little bit differently.
Well, and I also think it's such a different world now with so many AI tools that like if post 2020, 2021, that's round of research layoffs, if it was one set of questions there where you're like, oh, I'm going to dedicate myself in very strategic ways, it's actually now the question, and this is a question we ask a lot in our organization, how do you like 5x or 10x yourself? And that is like a very gnarly thing to think about as a researcher. But I think it's the question, if you want to be in the field, you have to continue to ask yourself, because it's not just our field. It's like design is undergoing the same kind of conversation, product management, engineering, like now that we have all of these tools at our hands. If a year ago I was like, oh, I have a plan that I want to build out the team, now I'm actually like, how can I be the most efficient as possible as a single researcher, knowing the tools that I have at play, so that when I add more people to the team, I'm very clear about our team's ROI in a way now that like there's a joke that people ask me constantly, how many people are on my team? Because I just I talk about myself in the royal we. Hot tip, researchers. I talk about myself in the royal we. I make sure that I'm very visible.
Can you quickly explain the royal we as a concept? I learned about this like 3 years ago or 4 years ago with Maggie, and it was a game changer for us.
Well, I just use we when I talk about myself. Like I just use the collective we for the research function. And so whenever I am discussing any research studies, it's always, we did this. When I'm talking about the research team, it's like, here is our plan. And so that people see a collectiveness in it and just assume there's a team of us when it is.
But it feels official.
It feels more official, and then people can see are like, oh, this team that exists. And part of it too, especially if you're a researcher of one, is building that visibility, especially when I work across 10 product managers and 10 designers, that like I make sure to build relationships with all of them, and then make sure that as many of them that have the tools that they need, like kind of prioritizing who's good at what skill so that they can do it themselves and be equipped. And that is the we. And even now, for researchers too, engineers and developers are such great research advocates because they're very rational and they're very invested in the details. And so many of my collaborators now are developers that I've trained on research interview techniques or other ones when they're in those technical calls, and that they're the most interested because they read all the papers, they read all of they know everything that's happening in the organization. And that is something that I wish I would have known earlier, because a lot of times I would go just to my designers, or I would work as a state, like with my product managers, and engineers were kind of peripheral. And now I'm actually like engineers, especially because they build the tools. We are building tools for them. They are such, like when I think about my team, I think about a couple of developers at LaunchDarkly that I would consider part of the research team before designers even.
How is it different building rapport with, whether it's, I guess, ICs versus, the more of the executive leaders that you work closely with? Is there a difference? Do you have to invest more time in one versus the other?
The altitude is different. Like I think, for a lot of the developers that I work with, they work they are experts in a product surface area. We have 8 or 10. They're like deep expertise in one area. And I think that one of a VP of product at LaunchDarkly, she actually talked to me about this. She's like, as you move up the ladder, you have to get more and more, become more and more of a generalist. And so in a way, like the altitude is different that you have to work at. Like they do not, when I'm talking to this VP, she doesn't always want to, hear the context of an individual interview with a developer about a particular problem, but wants to understand how this fits into how we translate this into our ARR numbers, or how this is important to this initiative we're working on. And with the developers, I can go very deep. We can talk for quite a bit of time about, I don't know, a single SDK piece like code snippet. And we can talk about that forever, about how important that is. And I actually feel like as a researcher, you have to do both. And it's a very hard, especially if you're a researcher of one, you have to be able to do both.
Did that come naturally to you, doing both? Or is that something that was really an acquired skill?
I think it's hard. It's hard because, I think this is the VP's, her main point is that I feel that I become less and less effective the more and more I spread out. The more and more you become a generalist, the risk of becoming less effective, because you're just going to you only have so much brain capacity. And so I have this constant anxiety of being like, oh, is it too general because I'm working across all of the product areas versus a single one, when what I would like to do, I have a PhD. I love to go deep on that one. I love a deep thought. I love to do a deep thinking exercise. And so the generalist aspect, I think, took more time for me and more time to understand the value. But at a business level, I think as you move on, I really just thought that was such an astute insight that I was like, oh, that's actually true. I have to be able to talk generally about all of those. I like all of the pieces of the business.
Yeah, there's a meta lesson in there, right? All these conversations about the, in air quotes, seats at the tables.
Yeah.
It's just a requirement to if you want to be there, right? This is one of the things where if you have a job at a large publicly traded company, the companies, I think it's every quarter or maybe it's twice a year, they have to put out reports to the shareholders where they extremely clearly outline what their priorities are. You gotta know that stuff, right? That's the cheat sheet. If you want to know what your boss's 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 boss cares about, it's literally in that document. It's
Exactly.
free.
Yeah.
You go to like whatever the SEC's website or whatever stock regulator it has. They have these forms. Just take a look.
I mean, even in private companies, a board of director report will have a very similar thing. And I agree. Like, if there were another like top piece of advice, I would say for every researcher, it's like know exactly what that document says at all times.
Yeah.
Know what's
Can you
changing.
get your hands on that internally?
Yeah.
Is that like a shared document?
Yes.
Interesting.
And if you can't, you can ask for it. And the reason that you can say it's important is like knowing the business fundamentals helps you do your job. And I think it is a bit shocking to me sometimes when researchers don't, or like UXers in general, don't know that, don't know those details. Because you're like, how can you help make decisions? Like, usability in and of itself isn't this amorphous concept to be like, make things lovely to use. Like, why do we want to make what useful to use? And I think it's like when I'm doing like training for the UX team, it's always like knowing, being really crisp about that impact and the impact to the business helps the prioritization, makes everything else make sense. So if you're like, it's like because of an adoption problem, or like we want to prioritize the top features to make this, land with a certain segment, then your research question changes, your prototype changes, all of the insights, instead of being like having it very generic, you're very clear about what you need to find out.
The people, I think, would be really surprised how precise these things can get, because if you're, let's say you're a private company, right? You're later stage startup, whatever it is, on paper there's this grow revenue, grow ARR, grow GMV if you're a marketplace, whatever it happens to be. If you see their like investor pitches, like let's say they raised funding recently, they'll get really precise there, where it's like, okay, in order to hit this ARR target or this free cash flow target, they'll break down certain metrics. Okay, so it used to be that customer acquisition cost was, or our payback period, which means how quickly you get your revenue back in terms of your sales and marketing expenses. It was 10 months. Over the last year, we got it down to 8 months. In order to hit our next series of targets, we have to get our payback period down to 6 months, right? And if you know that as a researcher, right, you can be like, oh my God, actually one of the 4 priorities for the company for the next 18 months is to reduce our payback period to 6 months. And so then if you just write in your reports at the very beginning, or whatever your share technique is, this is the impact on payback period, you're going to have so many best friends on the leadership team.
No, absolutely. And I do think that researchers are like to complain about, people not listening to them. But I think that's exactly true, that people clearly won't listen to you also, unless it feels like, if you provide information that is useful, that helps decision-making or whatnot, people are going to seek it out. People are hungry for that. And so I think even just back to that humbleness, like sometimes I've presented things and I was like, oh, this didn't land. And I'm like, oh, there's a clear reason. Sometimes it's hard to hear because it's something that is not as actionable as we want in the way that we need it to be, which feels really hard because you're like, wow, this is not a product we should be investing in, but we can't roll it back right now. That's one problem. But the other problem too is if you're delivering insights and they're like, so this is generically interesting, but like we can't do anything about it. And then you have to be humble to say like, oh, I didn't land it. Oh, I have to like try it again or like pivot in that way.
I love this. I think we're gonna wrap now, but this was really fantastic conversation, and I want to bring you back to talk more about, especially the business stuff and figuring out that translation stuff, and maybe I can bring in some questions from the community as well. I think that would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool, dude. Great to see you again.
Thanks for this. This is fun.
Yeah, we'll have you back on soon, and looking forward to catching up next time I'm either in Toronto or if you're in the Bay Area, we'll catch up then too.
Amazing. Thank you. Enjoy the new baby.
Talk to you soon, bud. Bye.
Bye.